I'm Sarah, 35, and I still remember the exact moment my father's laugh echoed through our house when my stepbrother-in-law Marcus declared he'd be running our family empire someday. Dad just smiled and asked if Marcus wanted more coffee. Funny how hindsight works, right? Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt underestimated by someone who clearly didn't know who they were messing with. You'll definitely want to stick around for what happened next. My father, Robert Mitchell, didn't start with much. Just a 22-year-old kid with a business degree from a state school and a dream bigger than his bank account. He spent 30 years building Mitchell Industries from a single construction contract into a multi-million-dollar empire. Not the flashy kind of business that makes headlines, but the solid, dependable kind that builds half the commercial buildings in 3 states. I grew up watching him work 16-hour days, missing school plays, but never missing the important stuff. He taught me about integrity, about treating people fairly, about building something that lasts. "Sarah," he'd say, reviewing blueprints at our kitchen table, "anybody can tear something down. It takes real character to build something worth keeping." When I was 15, Dad married Linda, a widow with a 10-year-old daughter named Emma. I'll be honest, I wasn't thrilled about suddenly having a stepmother and stepsister, but Dad had this way of making everyone feel wanted. Within 6 months, Linda wasn't just his wife, she was family. Emma wasn't just her daughter, she was his daughter too. The adoption papers were signed on Emma's 11th birthday. I remember Dad getting down on one knee, presenting her with a jewelry box that played "You Are My Sunshine," and officially asking if she wanted to be his daughter forever. Emma threw her arms around his neck and sobbed happy tears. Even I got a little misty-eyed, though I'd never admit it at the time. "Blood doesn't make family," Dad told us both that night. "Love and commitment make family. You girls are both my daughters, period." Emma thrived under Dad's guidance. She was smart, ambitious, and had this natural charm that made everyone love her instantly. Dad was so proud when she graduated valedictorian, when she got into business school, when she landed her first job. But as Emma grew up and started dating, I noticed Dad getting more protective. "It's not that I don't want her to be happy," he confided in me during one of our monthly dinners after Emma started getting serious with Marcus. "But something about that boy doesn't sit right with me. He talks about the business like it's already his, makes plans without asking, acts entitled to things he hasn't earned." I'd met Marcus a few times at family gatherings. Tall, good-looking, charming in that surface-level way that impresses parents at first meeting. But Dad was right. There was something off about how he inserted himself into business conversations, how he name-dropped clients like he'd personally secured their contracts. "Maybe you're just being an overprotective father," I suggested, though I'd noticed the same thing. Dad shook his head. "Sarah, I've been reading people for 30 years. That boy sees dollar signs when he looks at Emma, not love. Mark my words, if they get married, he'll think he's hit the jackpot." Looking back, I should have paid more attention to how often Dad's lawyer showed up at the house during Emma's engagement. At the time, I just figured it was normal business stuff. Corporate lawyers make house calls when you're worth what Dad was worth, right? Wrong. Dad was playing chess while Marcus was playing checkers. Emma and Marcus got married in a beautiful ceremony that Dad paid for without complaint. $30,000 for flowers alone, but he smiled and wrote the check. "Nothing's too good for my little girl," he said, though I caught him studying Marcus during the reception with that calculating look he got when reviewing contracts. After their honeymoon, Dad offered Marcus a position at Mitchell Industries. "Entry-level management," he explained to me privately. "Let him learn the business from the ground up like everyone else." Within 6 months, impressed by Marcus's enthusiasm and wanting to give his son-in-law a real chance to prove himself, Dad promoted him to operations manager with authority to approve routine vendor contracts and moderate expenditures. It was a gesture of trust and family goodwill that Marcus would later exploit ruthlessly. But Marcus had different ideas. Within his first month, he was suggesting improvements to processes that had worked for decades. He'd corner Dad's long-term clients at company events, promising them better deals and faster timelines without consulting anyone. He started referring to the company as "we" and "our business" in conversations with Emma's friends. The breaking point came during a board meeting I attended as part of my role in company finances. Marcus, who had no business being there, walked in and sat down like he belonged. When Dad's assistant asked if he was supposed to be present, Marcus waved her off. "I'm family," he said with that confident smile. "I should be involved in all major decisions." Dad's expression didn't change, but I saw his jaw tighten slightly. "Marcus, this is a board meeting for department heads and senior management. You're welcome to observe from the gallery. With respect, Robert, I think as Emma's husband and a future stakeholder in the business, I should have a voice in these discussions." The room went silent. Dad's longtime business partner, Tom Bradley, raised an eyebrow. Our head of operations, Maria Santos, suddenly found her notes very interesting. I wanted to sink through the floor. Dad smiled that polite smile he reserved for difficult clients. I appreciate your enthusiasm, son, but you've been here 6 weeks. Maybe let's focus on learning your current responsibilities before we discuss boardroom privileges. Marcus left the meeting, but his resentment was obvious to everyone present. Tom pulled me aside afterward. Your father's got a problem brewing, he said quietly. That boy thinks he's married into ownership, not employment. I started paying closer attention after that. Marcus would make unauthorized promises to suppliers, schedule meetings with potential clients without clearance, and consistently talk above his position. But the worst part was how he treated Emma like a gateway to Dad's business empire. I heard him on the phone one night when I stopped by their house. Emma was in the shower and Marcus didn't know I was there. Yeah, man, it's just a matter of time, he was saying. The old man won't live forever, and when he's gone, Emma inherits everything. We're talking $200 million minimum, plus all the real estate holdings. My blood ran cold. He was literally planning for my father's death like it was a business opportunity. Dad started working late more often, but not on construction projects. His home office light would be on until midnight, and I'd see legal documents scattered across his desk during my visits. When I asked about it, he'd just say he was updating some paperwork. What I didn't know was that he was systematically bulletproofing our family legacy. Dad had always been paranoid about estate planning, even before Emma married Marcus. He'd seen too many family businesses destroyed by inheritance disputes. Too many hardworking people lose everything to greedy relatives who showed up with lawyers after the funeral. But Marcus's behavior kicked that paranoia into overdrive. I want you to meet with my attorney next week, Dad told me over breakfast one Saturday morning. We're updating the succession planning, and there are some things you need to understand. David Chen had been Dad's lawyer for 15 years. A sharp guy who specialized in protecting family wealth from exactly the kind of predator Marcus was proving to be. His office was all dark wood and law books, the kind of place where serious money gets serious protection. Your father is concerned about certain vulnerabilities in the current estate structure, David explained diplomatically. We're implementing some safeguards to ensure the business remains stable regardless of family changes. The documents were complex, but the basic idea was simple. Create layers of protection that would prevent anyone from swooping in and liquidating Dad's life's work. Trust structures, voting rights, board compositions, all designed to keep control in responsible hands. What about Emma? I asked. She deserves her inheritance. Of course she does, Dad said. Emma will be well provided for. But there's a difference between providing for your daughter and handing over control to someone who hasn't earned it. The irony was that Marcus had no idea any of this was happening. He continued his power plays at the office, his casual references to when I'm running things, his increasingly bold attempts to involve himself in decisions above his pay grade. Dad handled it all with remarkable patience. He'd redirect Marcus's suggestions into proper channels, smile politely at his presumptuous comments, and maintain professional courtesy even when Marcus clearly tested his limits. But I could see the wheels turning behind Dad's calm exterior. Every overreach, every entitled assumption, every casual reference to the business as ours was being mentally cataloged and filed away. The funniest part, looking back, was how Marcus interpreted Dad's restraint as weakness. He actually seemed to think he was wearing Dad down, that his persistence would eventually pay off. He started making even bolder moves, scheduling client lunches without approval, and presenting himself as a company decision-maker to outside vendors. The boy's digging his own grave, Tom Bradley observed after Marcus promised a major client a 20% discount on a project that was already barely profitable. Robert's just letting him bury himself. Dad never lost his temper, never confronted Marcus directly, never gave any indication that he was anything other than a patient father-in-law trying to mentor an over-enthusiastic son-in-law. But those late nights in his office, those weren't about patience. They were about preparation. The attorney visits became a regular thing, though Dad was careful to schedule them when Emma and Marcus wouldn't be around. David Chen would arrive with his briefcase full of documents, and they'd disappear into Dad's study for hours. I started to understand the scope of what they were building when Dad asked me to witness some signature pages. These weren't simple wills or basic trust documents. This was a comprehensive legal fortress designed to protect everything Dad had built from every conceivable angle. Corporate structure changes, Dad explained when I asked about the complexity. Board composition requirements, voting trust arrangements, succession protocols. Think of it as insurance against bad judgment. Marcus, meanwhile, was getting bolder by the week. He started signing emails with Marcus Thompson Management Team Mitchell Industries, despite having no official management title. He promised a longtime client that we'd handle their expansion project for cost, apparently thinking he had authority to make such guarantees. Dad had to personally call the client to explain that Marcus had misstated our position, professionally, politely, but firmly. I'm sorry for the confusion, Jim. Marcus is still learning our pricing structures. Let me have Maria send you our actual proposal. When Marcus found out Dad had contradicted him, he was furious. I happened to be at Dad's office when Marcus stormed in, face red with embarrassment and anger. You made me look like an idiot in front of a major client, Marcus snapped, not caring that Dad's assistant and 2 department heads could hear every word. Dad's voice remained perfectly calm. You made a promise the company couldn't keep. I fixed it. I'm family, Robert. You should have backed me up, not undermined me. Family doesn't excuse incompetence, Marcus. And family definitely doesn't excuse making commitments that could cost the company money. Marcus left Dad's office that day looking like a man who just realized he wasn't as important as he thought he was. But instead of learning from the experience, he doubled down on his entitlement. He started having strategy sessions with Emma at home, sessions I accidentally overheard during one visit. Marcus was basically treating these conversations like business planning meetings, discussing how they'd restructure operations when we take over. Emma, to her credit, seemed uncomfortable with these conversations. I heard her say more than once that Dad was healthy and nowhere near retirement, and that maybe Marcus should focus on proving himself in his current role. But Marcus had clearly moved past the idea of proving himself. In his mind, he'd already inherited the business. He was just waiting for the formality of Dad's death to make it official. The sick part was how he talked about it like Dad was some obstacle to overcome, rather than the man who'd built everything Marcus wanted to inherit. There was no gratitude, no respect, no acknowledgement of what Dad had created. Just cold calculation about how to maximize his future wealth. Dad knew exactly what was happening, of course. He'd built a successful business by being able to read people, and Marcus was about as subtle as a billboard. But Dad's response wasn't anger or confrontation. It was methodical, careful planning. Every document David Chen brought to the house was another lock on the vault, another safeguard against Marcus's schemes, another way to ensure that Dad's life's work would survive his death intact. Marcus thought he was playing the long game. He had no idea Dad was playing a longer one. The heart attack came without warning on a Tuesday morning in March. Dad was reviewing blueprints for a new municipal complex when he collapsed at his desk. By the time the paramedics arrived, he was already gone. 64 years old, in apparently good health. Just gone. The doctor said it was massive and instant, that he wouldn't have suffered. Small comfort, but I held on to it anyway. The funeral arrangements fell to me naturally. Emma was too devastated to think about logistics, and Linda was barely holding herself together. I threw myself into the planning because it was easier than dealing with the grief. Dad would have wanted everything done properly, with dignity and respect for the hundreds of people whose lives he'd touched. We held the service at St. Matthew's, the church where he'd married Linda, where he'd watched Emma graduate from their youth program, where he'd been a quiet but generous supporter for over a decade. The sanctuary was packed with employees, clients, suppliers, community leaders, family friends. Dad had been more beloved than I'd realized. Father Martinez spoke beautifully about Dad's integrity, his generosity, his dedication to family. Tom Bradley shared memories of their 20-year business partnership. Maria Santos talked about how Dad had promoted her from bookkeeper to operations manager, how he'd believed in her when others wouldn't. Emma delivered a tearful eulogy about the man who'd chosen to be her father, who'd loved her unconditionally, who'd supported her dreams without reservation. There wasn't a dry eye in the church. The burial was private, just immediate family at Woodland Cemetery where Dad had purchased plots for himself and Linda years earlier. We stood around the grave in the March cold, saying our final goodbyes to the man who'd been the center of our family's universe. That's when Marcus decided to make his move. We were still at the graveside, the funeral director still arranging flowers, when Marcus stepped forward and put his arm around Emma's shoulders. His voice carried clearly in the quiet cemetery air. Emma's going to inherit the business and $200 million, he announced, looking directly at me. It's time this family recognized who's really in charge now. The silence that followed was deafening. Linda gasped. Tom Bradley's mouth fell open. Even the funeral director looked shocked at the timing and inappropriateness of the statement. But David Chen, standing off to the side in his black overcoat, made a sound I'll never forget as long as I live. He laughed. Not a cruel laugh. Not a mocking laugh. But the kind of involuntary chuckle that escapes when someone says something so fundamentally wrong that it's almost funny. The kind of laugh you make when someone confidently states that 2 + 2 = 7. Marcus's face went red. Something amusing about my wife's inheritance, David? David composed himself quickly, but his eyes were twinkling with knowledge that the rest of us didn't share yet. My apologies. Marcus, funeral emotions make us all say things we might regret. But I caught the look that passed between David and Tom Bradley. It was the look of two men who knew something Marcus didn't. Something that was going to change everything very soon. Marcus interpreted David's laughter as nervousness, as the reaction of a family lawyer who was about to lose his biggest client to new management. He had no idea that David had spent the last year crafting the legal equivalent of a nuclear bomb, one that was about to detonate in Marcus's face. The will reading was scheduled for the following Friday, giving everyone time to process Dad's death and make travel arrangements for out-of-state relatives. David's office seemed smaller with 15 people crammed into it, but Dad had wanted all the beneficiaries present for the reading. Marcus arrived early, dressed in his most expensive suit, and carrying a leather portfolio like he was preparing for a board meeting. He shook David's hand with the confident grip of a man who thought he was about to become very wealthy. Emma looked exhausted, still processing her grief, but Marcus kept whispering reassurances in her ear about their bright future and how Dad would have wanted them to take the company to new heights. Even in her grief, I could see Emma was uncomfortable with his tone. Linda sat quietly in the corner, supported by her sister who'd flown in from California. She looked fragile and lost, nothing like the strong woman who'd helped Dad build his later life's happiness. When David opened the file and began reading Dad's will, Marcus leaned forward eagerly. His expression grew more confident with each preliminary statement about sound mind and body, lawful witnesses, revocation of prior wills. Then David reached the substantive provisions. To my beloved wife Linda, I leave the family home, all personal effects, and a trust fund of $5 million, managed by the bank, to provide for her comfort and security for the remainder of her life. Nods around the room. Expected and appropriate. To various charities and employees, I make the following specific bequests. David read through a list of generous but not surprising gifts to the church. The United Way, several longtime employees. Marcus was practically vibrating with anticipation. To my daughter Emma Thompson, I leave $10 million to be held in trust with the following conditions. Marcus's smile faltered slightly as David read the restrictions. The money was Emma's, but it couldn't be transferred, borrowed against, or used as collateral without trustee approval. Her husband had no claim to it whatsoever. But the real bombshell was still coming. As for Mitchell Industries and all related business assets, I hereby establish the Mitchell Foundation, a charitable trust dedicated to supporting construction training programs and small business development. Control of the foundation will be exercised by a board of trustees consisting of, David read the list, Tom Bradley, Maria Santos, Father Martinez, the president of the community college, and 3 other community leaders, professional people, ethical people, people who understood Dad's values. Not Marcus. Not even Emma. Marcus's face went white, then red, then white again. There has to be a mistake. David looked up calmly. No mistake, Marcus. Robert was very specific about his intentions, but Emma is his daughter. She should inherit the business. Emma has inherited a substantial sum that will provide for her security for life. The business will continue to operate and provide employment for hundreds of people, while funding educational and charitable activities that Robert cared about. The genius of Dad's plan was becoming clear. He hadn't disinherited Emma out of spite or suspicion. He'd protected her from Marcus while ensuring his life's work would continue serving the community he loved. Marcus stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. This is ridiculous. We'll contest this. Emma has rights. David's smile was patient, but firm. The will was prepared over 18 months ago, reviewed by 3 independent attorneys, witnessed by multiple parties, and includes specific provisions addressing potential challenges. I'm confident it will withstand any legal scrutiny. As we left David's office that day, Marcus was already on his phone with some lawyer he'd found online, ranting about undue influence and fraudulent documents. But I remembered Dad's words from years earlier. Anybody can tear something down. It takes real character to build something worth keeping. Dad had built something worth keeping, and he'd made sure it would survive even the most determined attempt to tear it down. That evening, I found a sealed envelope in my mailbox with my name written in Dad's familiar handwriting. Inside was a short note. Sarah, the foundation will need someone who understands both business and family values to serve as executive director. The trustees have agreed to offer you the position if you're interested. Love, Dad. Even from the grave, he was still taking care of family while protecting what mattered most. Marcus wasted exactly 0 time mourning Dad's death. By Monday morning, 3 days after the funeral, he was calling an emergency leadership meeting at the office. I got the email at 7 a.m., sent from his personal account since his company access had been automatically suspended pending the board's review. The subject line read, Urgent. New management transition meeting, Monday 9 a.m. New management. I had to admire his confidence, even if it was completely misplaced. What do you think will happen next? Drop your predictions in the comments, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you're enjoying this family drama. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming. I arrived at the office to find Marcus in Dad's conference room, sitting at the head of the table like he owned the place. He'd even moved Dad's chair closer to the wall and brought in his own leather executive chair. The symbolism was subtle as a brick to the face. Tom Bradley, Maria Santos, and 3 department heads sat around the table looking deeply uncomfortable. Marcus had apparently summoned them for what he thought would be his coronation as new company leader. "Sarah, perfect timing," Marcus said with that confident smile that made my skin crawl. "I was just explaining to everyone how we're going to restructure operations now that we have fresh leadership." Tom cleared his throat. "Marcus, I don't think you understand the current legal situation." "What's to understand?" "Emma inherited the business, I'm her husband. Therefore, I'm running things now." Pretty straightforward. The silence in the room was deafening. Maria was staring at her notepad like it contained the secrets of the universe. The department heads were exchanging glances that clearly said, "How do we get out of here?" I decided to put everyone out of their misery. "Actually, Marcus, Emma didn't inherit the business. The business now belongs to a charitable foundation with an independent board of trustees." His smile faltered slightly. "That's just paperwork. Family businesses always have complex structures for tax purposes. The important thing is that Emma has controlling interest." "Emma has no interest in the business at all. Zero. The foundation controls everything." Now his smile disappeared entirely. "That's impossible. David Chen is just protecting assets during probate. Once everything settles, Emma will have full control." Tom Bradley spoke up gently but firmly. "Marcus, the will is final. Robert spent months with legal counsel specifically designing this structure. The business is no longer family-owned." I watched Marcus's face cycle through confusion, disbelief, anger, and back to confusion. It was like watching someone try to solve a math problem where 2 plus 2 suddenly equaled 17. "Who's on this board, then?" he demanded. Tom rattled off the list of trustees. "Community leaders, business professionals, the college president, people with integrity and no financial stake in the company's profits." "Where's my name? Where's Emma's name?" "Neither of you are trustees," Maria said quietly. Marcus stood up abruptly, his borrowed executive chair rolling backward into the wall. "This is ridiculous. I've been working here for 2 years. I know this business inside and out. I deserve a seat at the table." The irony was almost too delicious. Marcus thought 2 years of questionable performance entitled him to control over Dad's 30-year legacy. If Dad could have seen this moment, he would have laughed harder than David Chen did at the funeral. "The board will be meeting Thursday to discuss operational continuity," Tom explained. "Until then, department heads will continue reporting to me as interim general manager." "What about strategic decisions? Long-term planning, client relationships?" "Those will be handled by the trustees and senior staff. Your input will be considered." The way Tom said considered made it clear that Marcus's input would be filed directly in the trash can. As the meeting broke up, Marcus pulled me aside in the hallway. His confident facade was cracking, revealing the desperate man underneath. "Sarah, you have to help me understand this. Emma is Robert's daughter. She should have inherited everything. Emma inherited $10 million, Marcus. That's more than most people see in a lifetime. But the business, the company, that's where the real value is." I smiled sweetly. "The real value is in continuing Dad's work and supporting the community. Exactly what the foundation will do." What I didn't tell Marcus was that I'd already started implementing the next phase of Dad's plan. As someone with temporary voting rights during the transition, I had the authority to authorize routine audits and compliance reviews. And routine audits, it turns out, can uncover all sorts of interesting information. The auditing firm Dad's company had used for years was happy to conduct a comprehensive review during the ownership transition. "Standard procedure," I explained to anyone who asked. "The foundation trustees want a complete picture of the business before taking control." Marcus seemed nervous about the audit, but not overly concerned. After all, what could they find? He'd been careful, clever, discreet, or so he thought. The first red flag appeared in the vendor files. Marcus had approved several large contracts with Davidson Supply Company over the past 18 months. Nothing unusual there, except that Davidson Supply was owned by Marcus's college roommate, Jerry Davidson, and their prices were consistently 15 to 20% higher than our traditional suppliers. When I pulled the purchase orders, I found Marcus's signature authorizing the vendor change. His explanation, documented in an email to the procurement department, was that Davidson offered superior quality and reliability. But the materials were identical to what we'd used for years. just more expensive. The pattern repeated with Pinnacle Equipment Rentals, owned by Marcus's gym buddy. Then again with Elite Logistics, run by someone who shared Marcus's last name. Cousin, brother. I didn't really care about the family connection. I cared about the inflated pricing and the kickback potential. But the real smoking gun was in the payroll records. Marcus had been authorizing performance bonuses for himself every quarter, supposedly approved by Dad, but lacking any documentation of actual approval. These weren't small amounts either. We're talking 5-figure bonuses for a guy who'd been on the job less than 2 years and had no measurable performance metrics to justify the extra compensation. The more I dug, the clearer the pattern became. Marcus hadn't just been positioning himself to inherit the business. He'd been systematically stealing from it, using his marriage to Emma and his relationship with Dad as cover for increasingly brazen theft. My personal favorite was the consulting fee he'd paid to Thompson Advisory Services. A little research revealed that Thompson Advisory Services was a shell company registered to his brother in Nevada. For $12,000, this mysterious consulting firm had apparently provided strategic planning expertise to help Mitchell Industries optimize operational efficiency. The strategic planning expertise consisted of a 3-page document with recommendations like reduce waste and improve customer service. Brilliant insights that justified a $12,000 payment to Marcus's family. I documented everything meticulously. Spreadsheets comparing vendor prices, copies of all suspicious contracts, payroll records showing unauthorized bonuses, bank records for the shell companies. By the time I finished, I had a paper trail that would make a federal prosecutor weep with joy. The total damage was approaching $200,000 over 18 months. Not enough to bankrupt the company, but enough to fund a very comfortable lifestyle. Marcus had been treating Dad's business like his personal ATM, confident that his marriage to Emma would protect him from any consequences. What he didn't understand was that Dad had suspected something like this might happen. That's why the auditing firm had been specifically instructed to look for any irregularities in vendor relationships, bonus payments, and expense authorizations during the transition period. Marcus thought he'd been clever. Dad thought 3 steps ahead. As I compiled the evidence, I couldn't help but marvel at Marcus's audacity. He'd stolen money from the man whose daughter he'd married, whose business he claimed to love, whose legacy he'd promised to protect, and he'd done it all while positioning himself as the rightful heir to everything Dad had built. The beautiful irony was that Marcus's theft had occurred during the exact period when Dad was preparing his legal defenses. Every fraudulent contract, every unauthorized bonus, every kickback scheme had happened while Dad was working with David Chen to ensure Marcus would never get control of the company. Marcus had been digging his own grave while Dad was building the coffin. The trustee meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday in David Chen's conference room. I'd spent the weekend organizing the audit findings into a presentation that would make the situation crystal clear to everyone involved. Tom Bradley arrived early, looking grim, but not surprised. "How bad is it?" he asked, reviewing my executive summary. "Bad enough to justify criminal charges if we wanted to pursue them?" Maria Santos whistled softly when she saw the vendor comparison charts. I wondered why our materials costs had gone up so much. Marcus always said it was market fluctuation. Father Martinez, the college president, and the other community leaders listened in stunned silence as I walked through the evidence. These were people who'd known Dad for years, who'd respected his integrity and trusted his judgment. Seeing the systematic theft that had occurred under his nose was both shocking and infuriating. Robert suspected something like this might happen, David explained. That's why he insisted on specific audit provisions in the foundation charter. He wanted protection against exactly this type of behavior. The evidence was overwhelming. Inflated contracts, kickback schemes, unauthorized bonuses, shell company payments. Marcus had been running a sophisticated embezzlement operation while presenting himself as a dedicated son-in-law. "What's our legal exposure?" asked Dr. Williams, the college president. "Minimal," David replied. "The foundation isn't responsible for pre-existing theft, but we need to address this before taking full operational control." Tom leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. 30 years Robert spent building this company's reputation. 30 years of honest dealing, fair pricing, reliable service. And this kid nearly destroyed it all for pocket change. The numbers were damning, but they only told part of the story. I'd also discovered emails where Marcus discussed his plans with Emma, emails where he treated the business like it was already his property, where he made promises to friends about future contracts once he was running the show. The most revealing email was one he'd sent to his brother about the Nevada consulting company. "Rob will never notice 12 grand, and even if he does, what's he going to do? Fire his daughter's husband? Family connections have their advantages." Reading those words out loud to the trustees felt like exposing Marcus's soul. Here was a man who'd married into a family, been welcomed and supported, given opportunities and trust, and responded by stealing from the people who'd shown him kindness. "I recommend we schedule a meeting with Marcus for Thursday," David said. "Give him an opportunity to explain these discrepancies before we take formal action." Dr. Williams nodded. Due process is important, even in clear-cut cases like this. But I could see the determination in everyone's faces. These were serious people who didn't tolerate theft or betrayal. Marcus had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, broken trust that couldn't be repaired. "What about Emma?" Father Martinez asked gently. "She's been through so much already." "Emma will be protected," I assured him. "The Foundation's legal team will handle this carefully. She doesn't need to be involved in the criminal aspects unless she chooses to be." As we left the meeting, Tom pulled me aside. "Your father would be proud of how you've handled this, Sarah. He always said you had the best combination of heart and brains in the family." Walking to my car, I thought about Dad's final gift to all of us. He'd protected the business from Marcus's greed, ensured Emma would be financially secure, and given me the tools to expose the truth. Even in death, he was still taking care of the people he loved. Marcus thought he'd been playing a long game, slowly positioning himself to inherit everything. He had no idea that Dad was playing an even longer game, one that would end with complete justice. The Thursday meeting was going to be very interesting. Marcus arrived at David Chen's office on Thursday morning dressed like he was attending a board meeting. Expensive suit, leather portfolio, confident stride. He probably thought this was some routine transition discussion where his input would be valued and his position confirmed. He had no idea he was walking into his own execution. "Marcus, thank you for coming," David said professionally. "We have some financial discrepancies we'd like you to help us understand." I slid the first folder across the conference table. "Let's start with Davidson Supply Company. Can you explain why we switched vendors for our primary materials supplier?" Marcus barely glanced at the documents. "Better pricing, superior quality, standard business decision. Superior quality that costs 20% more than our previous supplier? You pay for what you get." Robert always emphasized the importance of reliable vendors. Tom Bradley leaned forward. "Marcus, Davidson Supply is owned by Jerry Davidson, your former college roommate. Did you disclose this relationship when authorizing the vendor change?" For the first time, Marcus looked genuinely surprised. "How did you— Jerry's company provided the best value proposition. Best value at 20% markup?" I asked sweetly. "That's an interesting definition of value." David opened the second folder. "What about Pinnacle Equipment Rentals? Also significantly more expensive than our traditional rental companies. Also owned by someone you know personally." Marcus's confident facade was beginning to crack. "Look, I know these people are qualified. I trust their work. That's worth paying a little extra for reliability." "A little extra?" Maria Santos had been quiet up to this point, but the numbers clearly offended her professional sensibilities. "Marcus, these contracts cost the company an extra $60,000 over 18 months. That's not a little extra. That's systematic overpayment." "What about Thompson Advisory Services?" I asked, sliding the most damning folder across the table. $12,000 for a 3-page report recommending that we reduce waste and improve customer service. Pretty expensive advice for such obvious suggestions. Marcus went pale. "I don't recall the specific details of that consulting engagement." "Really? Because Thompson Advisory Services is owned by your brother in Nevada. The same brother who lives in your guest house 3 months out of the year?" The silence in the room was deafening. Marcus looked around the table like a trapped animal, realizing for the first time that this wasn't a friendly business discussion. This was an interrogation. "I think there's been some misunderstanding," he said, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "These were all legitimate business expenses approved through proper channels." David slid the payroll records across the table. "What about the quarterly bonuses you authorized for yourself? $25,000 total over the past year. Can you show us Robert's approval for these payments?" Robert knew about the bonuses. He wanted to reward good performance. But there's no documentation of his approval. No emails, no written authorization, no board minutes, just your signature authorizing payment to yourself. Tom's voice was ice cold. "Marcus, you've been stealing from this company for 18 months. Vendor kickbacks, unauthorized bonuses, fraudulent consulting fees. The total exceeds $200,000. Marcus stood up abruptly, knocking his chair backward. "This is ridiculous. I'm family. I would never steal from Robert's company." "You're not family," I said quietly. "You're Emma's husband, and you've been using that relationship to commit fraud." The room went silent. Marcus looked around the table one more time, seeing only stern faces and damning evidence. His shoulders sagged as the reality of his situation finally penetrated his denial. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. David's response was crisp and professional. Your employment is terminated immediately for cause. Security will escort you from the premises. All company property must be returned, including keys, access cards, and any confidential information. And the criminal charges? That depends on whether you cooperate with the transition and asset recovery process. Full cooperation might influence our decision about involving law enforcement. Marcus gathered his things in stunned silence. 2 security guards were waiting outside the conference room to ensure his departure was swift and complete. As he reached the door, he turned back one final time. Emma doesn't know about any of this. We know, I said. Emma will be protected. Unlike you, we actually care about family. Watching Marcus walk out of David Chen's office, I felt a profound sense of completion. Dad's plan had worked perfectly. The thief had been exposed, the company was protected, and justice had been served without Emma being damaged in the process. Marcus thought he was smart enough to steal from a man who'd built a business empire through careful planning and attention to detail. He learned the hard way that Dad was always 3 steps ahead. Emma called me that evening, her voice shaky and confused. Sarah, Marcus came home acting strange. He said he'd been let go from the company, but he won't explain why. Do you know what happened? I'd been dreading this conversation all day. Emma deserved to know the truth, but she also deserved to hear it gently from someone who loved her. Can I come over? This isn't something we should discuss on the phone. When I arrived at Emma's house an hour later, Marcus was nowhere to be seen. He left to stay at his brother's place, Emma explained. Said he needed time to think about his options. More likely, he needed time to figure out which assets he could hide before the investigation deepened. I sat Emma down in her living room, the same room where I'd overheard Marcus planning Dad's financial future years earlier. The irony wasn't lost on me. Emma, Marcus was terminated for stealing from the company. We found evidence of vendor fraud, unauthorized bonuses, and kickback schemes going back 18 months. The color drained from Emma's face. Stealing? That's impossible. Marcus would never... I opened my briefcase and pulled out copies of the key documents. I'm sorry, but the evidence is overwhelming. He's been using his position to enrich himself and his friends at the company's expense. Emma stared at the vendor contracts, the payroll records, the bank statements for Thompson Advisory Services. I watched her process the information, seeing her husband's betrayal laid out in black and white. He used my name, she whispered, pointing to a contract where Marcus had written, "Approved by Emma Thompson," in the margin. He forged my approval on company documents. That's what made this so devastating, Emma. Marcus didn't just steal from Dad's company. He used your reputation and your relationship to Dad as cover for his crimes. Emma began to cry. Not the dramatic tears of someone seeking sympathy, but the quiet tears of someone whose world had just collapsed. The man she'd married, the man she'd trusted, had been systematically stealing from her adoptive father while planning to inherit everything. How could I not have known? She asked. How could I live with someone for 3 years and not see this? Because you're a good person who assumes other people are good too. Marcus counted on that. He counted on Dad's love for you, your trust in him, and the family's desire to avoid conflict. I handed her tissues and sat quietly while she processed the magnitude of Marcus's betrayal. The man who'd promised to love and honor her had been stealing from her father's legacy, using her name as a shield, and planning to control assets that weren't his to take. What do I do now? Emma asked finally. First, you protect yourself legally. Marcus involved you in his schemes without your knowledge. We need to make sure you're completely separated from any criminal liability. I pulled out a business card. This is Jennifer Walsh, one of the best family attorneys in the state. She specializes in protecting spouses from partners' criminal activities. I've already spoken with her about your situation. Second, you need to decide about your marriage. I can't make that choice for you, but I can tell you that Marcus's behavior shows a pattern of deception and manipulation that goes far beyond financial crime. Emma nodded slowly. He never loved me, did he? I was just his ticket to Dad's money. I think Marcus loved the idea of you, the successful daughter of a wealthy businessman, the key to everything he wanted but couldn't earn himself. Over the next 2 hours, we went through Emma's options step by step. Jennifer Walsh could handle the divorce proceedings while protecting Emma's inheritance from any claims Marcus might make. The Foundation's legal team would ensure that Emma wasn't implicated in Marcus's crimes. Most importantly, the trust provisions Dad had insisted on meant that Marcus had no claim to Emma's $10 million. He'd married her thinking he was marrying into wealth, but Dad's careful planning had ensured that the wealth would remain with Emma alone. Dad knew, didn't he? Emma asked as I prepared to leave. He saw what Marcus was really like and protected me from him. Dad loved you enough to prepare for every possibility, even the ones he hoped would never happen. As I drove home that night, I thought about Dad's final act of protection. He'd saved Emma from financial ruin, saved the company from a predator, and ensured that justice would be served even from beyond the grave. Marcus thought he was playing the long game. Dad played the longest game of all. 6 months later, Mitchell Industries was thriving under the foundation's management. The inflated vendor contracts had been renegotiated, saving the company nearly $100,000 annually. Employee morale was higher than it had been in years, partly because everyone knew they were working for something larger than corporate profits. Marcus had disappeared quietly, his divorce from Emma finalized without drama thanks to the prenuptial agreement Dad's lawyer had insisted on. The criminal charges were dropped in exchange for full restitution and a signed confession detailing his schemes. He'd moved to another state, probably to find new opportunities for reinventing himself. Emma was doing well, considering everything she'd been through. The therapy had helped her process not just Marcus's betrayal, but also her grief over losing Dad. She'd started using her inheritance to support causes Dad had cared about, including a scholarship fund for kids from working-class families who wanted to study business or engineering. "I want to do something that would make Dad proud," she'd told me when we met for lunch the previous week. "He gave me so much more than money. He gave me values and purpose." I'd taken the position as executive director of the Mitchell Foundation, using my business background to ensure Dad's legacy continued growing. We were funding construction training programs at 3 community colleges, providing small business loans to local entrepreneurs, and supporting youth sports leagues throughout the region. If this story resonated with you, make sure to like and subscribe for more stories about family, justice, and the power of careful planning. Sometimes the best revenge isn't immediate satisfaction, but long-term protection of the people and values you love most. The Foundation's offices were in the same building where Dad had started Mitchell Industries 30 years earlier. His picture hung in the conference room, not as a shrine to the past, but as a reminder of the values that guided our work: integrity, fairness, community service, and the understanding that true wealth comes from building things that last. Tom Bradley stopped by my office that afternoon, carrying a folder of proposals from local charities requesting foundation support. "Your father would be amazed by what this has become, Sarah. He built a company to provide for his family. Now it's providing for hundreds of families." "That's exactly what he would have wanted," I replied, reviewing applications for the construction training program. "Dad always said the best businesses serve their communities, not just their owners." The final twist in Dad's plan had taken months to fully appreciate. By converting the business into a charitable foundation, he'd ensured that it would never be vulnerable to the kind of greed and mismanagement that Marcus represented. Future generations couldn't sell it, rate it, or destroy it. It would continue serving the community indefinitely, a living monument to Dad's values. Marcus had spent 2 years positioning himself to inherit a multi-million-dollar business. Instead, he'd lost his job, his marriage, his reputation, and his freedom. The man who'd stood over Dad's grave announcing his inheritance plans had ended up with nothing except criminal charges and public shame. The beautiful irony was that Dad's real wealth had never been the money or the business assets. It was the relationships he'd built, the values he'd instilled, the community he'd served. That wealth couldn't be stolen, inherited, or destroyed. It could only be passed forward to people who understood its true value. Emma and I had both inherited that real wealth. We'd learned from Dad's example how to build things that matter, how to protect the people we love, and how to ensure that justice prevails even when it takes time to arrive. Marcus thought he was marrying into money. He had no idea he was challenging a man who'd spent 30 years learning how to protect everything that mattered to him. Dad got the last laugh after all. And it was even better than David Chen's laugh at the funeral, because it lasted forever.